Okay, well, I guess that's my cue. Hello, everybody, and welcome to South Carolina Linux Users Groups, Upstate Carolina Linux Users Group here in Greenville, and Columbia Linux Users Group in Columbia. How you doing, Ben?
Great.
Good to see everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks for arriving online as well. And tonight we've got Joel Griffith, who's going to talk about entropy and randomness and heat death, I guess we talked about a little bit.
If we get there, time at the end, we'll do the heat death of the universe.
And so I'll let you take it away then.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, hello, everyone. Nice to see and meet some of you. My name is Joel Griffith. The topic for tonight is the disordered sysadmin's intro to entropy. We'll spend a little time going over entropy as an abstract concept before moving on to what entropy and randomness have to do with Linux and with issues in Linux system administration. Now, I've got to start by saying I am not an expert on cryptography. It's likely that there are folks here in the audience who are, or who at least know a lot more than I do about it. So if I say anything incorrect, please speak up. Let me know. I'm happy to be corrected, or if there's just anything that needs more elaboration, I'm happy to take a question anytime. I have been a Linux system administrator for about 10 years now, but like many of us, I don't have any formal training at that, so I'll let you decide for yourself how much experience that counts for. I do have a background in physics, so that's why I decided to focus on entropy as the topic of the night, since that concept originates out of physics. The word entropy gets thrown around a lot, so if nothing else, I hope I can help you take away a clearer understanding of what it means, where it comes from, and what people are talking about when they use it. So we'll start with an abstract definition of entropy, and then in a moment we'll look into some examples that might clarify a bit more. But we'll start with this definition. The entropy of a system is a measure of the difference between everything you could possibly know about it and what you actually know about it. So in other words, you take the set of all information that it takes to fully specify exactly what state the system is in, and you represent that as a circle. That's the big circle. But we never actually know all that. Now, almost never actually know everything you can know. Usually what we know is a subset of that. And so we represent that subset of information as the smaller circle inside the bigger one. So the entropy is the area of the difference between those two circles. That's an abstraction. Let's take a look at a couple of real examples. Okay, so example one, a tube of neon gas. So in this case, everything there is to know about it means the exact position and momentum of every single neon atom inside that tube, and there's a lot. So that's the big circle, everything there is to know. We never know that. We just can't measure that much information about these atoms. Instead, what we can measure is the volume of the tube, its temperature, its pressure, total energy, all those things. And so by measuring those things, we don't learn the position and momentum of any of the atoms, but we get constraints on them. And those constraints represent information that we have. So that becomes the smaller circle. The difference between those two is the entropy of this tube of gas. And this specific formulation of entropy is what we call thermodynamic entropy, or sometimes Boltzmann entropy, after the magnificently bearded fellow who first came up with it. This is what you learn about in a physics course on thermodynamics. So we can consider a completely different example here. So in this case, we've got a signal broadcast by radio waves. In this case, everything there is to know means the exact waveform that was emitted from the transmitter. What we actually know is what we receive on our end. Real-world conditions will mix the signal with noise so that we can only identify a subset of the information that the broadcaster intended for us to receive. We can characterize that difference, the noise, as entropy. Communication entropy, we can say. Now, so the third example, this will bring us a little bit closer to the goal of tonight's discussion, and that is a password. In this case, everything there is to know means knowing the password. Ideally, that information is held by one and only one person. Other people, though, might know some constraints about the password, like how long it is, or if it has a minimum number of special characters, or they might even know the hash of it if you break into the database and find your password stored there. All that is some information about your password. So you can use that to define a form of entropy that quantifies the difference and tells you how secure your password is. Those three examples are pretty wide-ranging, and if you want a complete, precise description of entropy for each one, you more or less have to start from scratch and develop a method of quantifying entropy or quantifying information for each case and so on. But there's one principle that unites them all, and that's this. Entropy measures how hard it is to guess what you don't know in all cases. So in the examples I just showed you, the bigger the unknown area is, the more hidden options there are in there, and the harder it is for you to guess what state the system is in based just on what you can measure. So take the tube of neon. If we raise its temperature, we're adding energy. The atoms start moving faster. There's a broader range of momentums, and therefore it's even harder for us to guess what the actual momentum is of any atom. So as a rule, hotter systems have a higher thermodynamic entropy than colder systems. Or for the radio broadcast, if there's only a little bit of static in the signal that we receive, then our human brains are pretty powerful pattern recognition machines. We can usually fill in what we're missing and still get the audio if we're listening to something, or the video if we're watching. But if there's too much static, too much noise, too much entropy, then we can't guess what we're supposed to be seeing or hearing. And in the case of a password, the third example, let's say there's only 6 characters in your password, then it's much easier for me to brute force my way through the options and guess what it is. So a 6-character password is a low entropy password, easily guessed. So we're not going to worry about technical definitions of entropy for this talk. We're just going to focus on this idea here. High entropy, hard to guess. Low entropy, easy to guess, or easier to guess. It's not always easy in the strict definition, but it's really interesting to me how far you can take this idea that entropy is just guessing. Back in the 1950s, a guy working at Bell Labs, the telephone company, got interested in the problem of how communication works when some of the signal is lost. He wanted to quantify how you can communicate effectively when the receiver has to guess what information is missing from a noisy signal. So he did this. He got volunteers and he showed them phrases that had some of the letters removed, or in some case, the entire phrase was hidden, and he asked the volunteer to guess what was missing. So here's one example you can see. He had someone guess a hidden phrase. And right below here is, for each letter, the number of guesses it took the person to figure out what the letter was. And you can see the person is not guessing randomly. This person is guessing with a knowledge of the English language. You can see the first 3 guesses, T-H-E, he got in one try. Because this person obviously knows the word, the 3-letter word, is the most common word in the English language. It's more probable than anything else that starts the sentence. But then you can see once you get to the R, he starts to stumble. It takes him 5 guesses to get the R because there's more ways to go there. So by repeating these experiments enough, this researcher was able to work out a measure of entropy for the English language. And since any language is just one particular method of encoding information, this amounted to finding a measure of entropy for information itself. Now, you might know the guy I'm talking about was named Claude Shannon, and the measure he devised is what we now call Shannon entropy. And by the way, if anyone is interested, the large language models that have been produced in the last few years, like ChatGPT, this is how they work. They guess one word at a time, based on their training data, just like Shannon's test subjects were guessing one letter or one word at a time based on their life experience of speaking English. What the difference between those two is maybe philosophical. But I haven't looked into it, but I have to guess that the entropy of language as a mathematical construction is a big part of the research that goes into this. But so anyway, when we talk about entropy in relation to data and to programming, we are talking about Shannon entropy. So specifically for an operating system like Linux, there are certain things we want it to do that we want to be hard for people to guess, like cryptography keys and passwords. Now, if you stop to think about it, this is kind of a problem for computers because computers are fully deterministic systems. If I know the program the computer is running, I can predict its output precisely. So how do computers do things that are hard to guess? The short answer looks like this. The operating system gathers entropy from random or unguessable interactions with its environment, primarily devices that interact with the operating system while not being part of the operating system itself. Hard drives, peripherals, mice, keyboards, network cards, all of that. Now, as a brief schematic, that raw entropy is then fed through a hashing function into an internal entropy pool. Bits from that entropy pool are then fed through a cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generator. That's C-spring. I will abbreviate that as C-spring from now on because I don't want to have to say that a lot. But the bits from that pool are fed through a C-spring into an API that other parts of the system can then hit up whenever they want random numbers for whatever they're doing with them. In Linux, in particular, this system as a whole is known as the Linux pseudo-random number generator, or in most sources abbreviate that as LRNG. So I guess we're forgetting the pseudo part of the pseudo-random when we abbreviate it. So here's a more detailed description of that system. By the way, I'm going to switch out here real fast. If anyone wants to, where did I leave it? Nope. So if this is making anyone dizzy, I'm trying to find tour bubbles. Where do you go? There we go. If anybody wants to examine anything I'm talking about here in more detail, the Linux kernel is open source software. You can go straight to Linus Torvalds' GitHub page and look at it. Your starting point is going to be this file, drivers/char/random.c. This file goes back a ways. It was originally written by Theodore Tso and Matt McCall, and then more recently, you can't see the name. I can't see the name. Let's see if I can scroll there. There we go. More recently, Jason Donenfeld made a lot of improvements to this, and we'll see a few of those. Now let me get back to the slideshow. Nope.
That was it.
No, that was.
Oh.
I wanted to go from this
wrong page.
current slide. There we go. Great.
Yeah.
So first, entropy sources. We were talking about this a little bit before the session started. So the kernel's random.c file provides a set of functions that other files, that device drivers within the kernel can use to harvest entropy from their devices and report it back. And the three most important are the ones I have listed here. There's add disk randomness. This is used by hard disk drivers to gather randomness from the seek times for various requests. There's add input randomness. This function is used by drivers for mice and keyboards and other peripherals to gather randomness from unguessable user interactions, like when you jiggle the mouse or when you press a key. And there's add interrupt randomness. This is used by devices that generate interrupt requests, usually abbreviated IRQs, that gather randomness from things like network interactions or USB drive access Now, the raw entropy gathered by these methods is expected to be highly random. Even if you're watching me jiggle my mouse, figuring out exactly when I do that down to the millisecond is pretty hard, especially if you go through and try to find out differences between milliseconds. But you don't get a lot. So I found this table here that shows how many actual raw bits of entropy each type of operating system event has in it. And you can see it's just a handful of bits each. And the kernel doesn't even take those directly. So instead, these functions have an algorithm that combines multiple events. It takes the time of, like, I think usually 4 events, and takes the time differences between them and shuffles them around and takes the time differences between those and those, so on and so on, with the end result that the final harvestable entropy from each event is even smaller than these numbers per event. So instead of storing those directly, the kernel passes them through a hash function, a one-way function that outputs a fixed number of bits. That's a way of sort of amplifying what you get from those tiny seeds. The hash function currently used in the Linux kernel is called Blake2s. This was introduced in version 5.7 back in March of 2022. Before that, the kernel used the SHA1 function, or secure hash algorithm, or SHA1, which is still pretty famous. That's the hash function that Git uses to identify everything. But it has been known to be attackable for over a decade now. So that's no longer in the Linux RNG. Now, around that same time period, 2022, early 2020s in general, a large number of improvements were made to the LRNG. We'll see a couple of others. That's maybe the biggest. So given the raw entropy input, that's this hash function, Blake2s, outputs to the kernel's entropy pool, sometimes called the input pool or the primary pool, depending on who's writing. As far as I can tell, this pool only exists in memory. There are no functions or files in user space that allow you to access it. The pool itself is not stored across reboots, although a seed of it is, so that at the next reboot, that seed is used to replenish the internal, the primary pool. But even then, the entropy in this pool is not itself distributed to applications. Instead, whatever entropy is needed by the operating system or by processes running in it, little bits of the pool are used to seed a C-spring, and the output of that is used to pass on to the application. So a C-spring, pseudo-random number generator, takes some input and uses it to generate a series of outputs iteratively. Now, as with all code, they're fully deterministic for a given input, but if that input is sufficiently random or unguessable, then the output sequence will have a distribution that is indistinguishable from fully random in the mathematical sense, up to the practicality of computing enormous things. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking a small number of digits straight from interaction with devices that, even though there's a small number of them, in principle, they have a high entropy, and you're spreading that out over a larger number of digits. So in principle, the result you end up with is maybe guessable in theory, but it would take you millions of years, billions of years to actually do the computation necessary to guess what comes out of these C-springs. So for all meaningful purposes, the output number here is as computationally secure as pure entropy, and you get a lot more of it out of this process. The C-spring in the Linux kernel currently is called Cha-Cha-20. It's based on a pseudo-random number generator called Salsa-20. It's related to an algorithm called Rumba-20. They have these names because I guess because they mix digits around in a pattern that's supposed to resemble a complicated dance step. So we give them these names for, I guess, humor purposes. So the introduction of the C-spring itself was another one of the big changes that was introduced a few years ago. Before that, when the first Linux random number generator did not have, well, pseudo-random number generator didn't have this component, the C-spring component at all, because I believe at that time there were more strict export restrictions on cryptographic applications, and they couldn't use something that powerful. Yeah, I guess that's been relaxed by now. I'm not sure exactly what the legal story is. Yeah. So from the primary pool, the kernel doles out entropy through the C-spring to requesting functions in 3 different ways. The first is this function get random bytes. This is a function in the kernel. It is only used within the kernel. And then you have the 2 user space files or file-like objects, dev random and dev urandom. As a user, if you want to use the entropy of the LRNG, these 2 files are your access points. As you might expect for an issue in open source computing where there are 2 choices, the difference between them is the subject of a great deal of debate, to say the least. So I will tell you that the facts are that fundamentally the difference is dev random blocks, meaning that if you ask it for entropy and it doesn't have enough, it will bring the process to a halt until enough is generated. Now that's good for security, but it's bad for programming because you really need to know usually that your code is going to complete in a timely manner. Thus, we also have urandom. I think the U there is for unlimited because it does not block. If you ask it for entropy and it doesn't have enough, it will reuse bits from the primary pool, pass them back through the C-spring until it does have enough entropy. So historically, the conventional wisdom has been that random is preferable to urandom because its entropy is better, or you might say uncut. However, since the improvements I mentioned a few years ago, the introduction of the Cha-Cha-20 C-spring, both dev random and dev urandom output from it. And since that's considered cryptographically secure, more and more, the argument is that there's no meaningful difference between them anymore, if there ever was much. Without forming an opinion on it personally, I will say I couldn't find a record of any big cryptography-heavy application that uses random instead of urandom. Everything seems to prefer urandom. In particular, all major browsers, Google Authenticator, OpenSSH, which provides the SSH keygen utility we use for making keys, and even the C standard library has a get random function that draws from urandom. So I think that seems like at least a tacit acknowledgement that urandom is perfectly acceptable for strong cryptography, and it doesn't block. So that's the outline of the process under the hood. That's how you get from physical entropy to what you need for your application. Any questions so far on what we've looked at? Anything I've messed up?
How do you go about using up available randomness, so to speak, that would cause it to block? I mean, is that large numbers of calls or something, or a particularly intricate number? Or
the kernel keeps track of how much entropy is in the pool and has been assigned to each of the random and urandom devices. So it keeps track of that every time when you make calls and you pull entropy out, decrements that counter.
But the measuring of the source is more mechanical and then more slower. I mean, the input where it measures the entropy coming in is more laborious and more.
It does take a while.
Tedious, so to speak.
Right, like I was saying, you only get a few bits at a time from entropy. And then once you process
what is it at a time? Like time period? So, I mean, so to speak.
Usually, I think we're talking about milliseconds to microseconds.
We can make a measurement of this thing. Okay.
You're looking at differences between those intervals.
So if you've got a gigahertz clock rate, that's your, okay. I've already used that measurement. It comes back and says, can't use that measurement.
You need to be moving your mouse, typing on the keyboard, accessing the disk, and having interrupts on your
Yes,
CPU.
and it is waiting for those to, and they get used up once they've done that.
I've actually got a graph on this a little bit later.
But that makes sense. Okay.
Hold on to that
Perfect sense
thought,
now.
and we'll definitely come back to that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you get the sources, the entropy sources come from these add randomness functions. Are those things that like the drivers need to call? So like
Mhm.
the devices are I suppose, sending the entropy as opposed to the operating system pulling in.
Right.
So
So,
if you have a mouse and the person writing the driver didn't feel like adding that call, you just wouldn't be getting any.
right. Yeah, right. So the random.c file exports those functions. It's up to the authors of each driver to use them and to send data back. So yeah, you're exactly right. If somebody doesn't do that, then you just don't get entropy from that source.
What about using things like cron jobs and as a source of entropy, or other like background tasks?
Cron jobs are pretty regular. I would be suspicious of
Okay, I see.
getting entropy from those. Those are guessable.
Right.
They always
What
make
about
sense.
CPU fan speed?
That might be something. I don't know.
You could mix up your CPU or you could put a predetermined stress on it and do some sort of weird, I don't know. I'm
Potentially.
trying to think of stuff.
Potentially.
I've been having computer problems and it was making fan noises today before it died that I hadn't heard before.
There are more general functions made available that you could use.
You know, I'm just thinking of, there's so much, that's why I was thinking of running out of entropy, because there seems to be so much energy transfer going on inside that box
Mhm.
so fast, but not compared to a running program making calls.
Yes. You're
Like him dealing
certainly.
50,000 hands of cards.
Well, this is actually a good segue into what is what is all using all this entropy. Now that we know what's going on under the hood, we can ask, how is all this actually manifesting in practice? So I found this report here. It's entropy transfers in the Linux random number generator by this list of authors. So what they did,
You need to read them out to us.
I'm afraid I will not do them justice. It's just in order to avoid that, I'll
Sorry.
allow the reader to absorb this information on their own. But they did a deep dive examination of everything that goes on in this system I just showed you for real world systems. Now, this is from 2012, so it's a bit old, and in particular, this is back during the SHA-1 hash before those updates. But the results we're going to see, I don't think really depend on that. So I would expect roughly similar results to what you'll see here if we repeated these today. So they compared a desktop system, a file server, and a computing server, all running Ubuntu 12.04. So for sources of entropy, the desktop system was pretty evenly split among keyboard and mouse peripherals and hard drive lookups. The darker blue is hard drive at 28%. The mouse and keyboard are these 34, 35%. So roughly about a third each for those. The other 2% in the middle, that's other peripherals. That might be a fan. I don't know, something like that.
There's so much stuff you read about these things people measure.
The two servers, the file server and the computing server, of course, they have no peripherals. They took 100% of their raw entropy from hard drive lookups. But notice none of them took any entropy from interrupt requests over the course of the experiment, which the authors noted, but they didn't really delve into beyond saying there must not have been any of the right kind of IRQs. So they left it there. I will too. They also examined which entropy interfaces were used. Remember, there's three: the kernel function get random bytes, and the two dev random and dev urandom files. So over the course of this experiment, none of the systems used dev random. So again, we see that in the wild, programmers prefer the non-blocking urandom, and this was even before the introduction of the C-spring. The desktop system was almost evenly split between the user space access using urandom and kernel-only access using get random bytes, whereas the file server leaned heavily into the use of random numbers only internal to the server, 80% to 20%, internal to the kernel, not the server, 80 to 20. And the computing server was just entirely kernel only, get random bytes. I was surprised myself to see that the kernel uses that much of the entropy generated by the LRNG. So being a system administrator, I'm used to thinking of randomness being needed mostly for generating cryptography keys. Does anyone know or have a guess what the kernel is using this entropy for? Online people? If you like, I can give you a hint.
SSL,
Hmm?
SSH and SSL, and
Is it for some sort of asynchronous something where it's got?
It's not an asynchronous, and I believe, as far as I know, most of the SSL stuff happens in user space.
Figuring out when to panic.
Kernel panic? Yeah, that seems to be pretty random. Good guess. I don't know how much that really does contribute, but so this chart here, this shows the main consumers of entropy during the experiment for the desktop. K here means kernel, U means user space. So you see this kernel function load elf binary. That's what's using a big chunk of entropy from this pool, 46%. Does anyone know that one? I did not. I'm happy to admit. ELF stands for.
Well, yeah, like why does it need like entropy?
I know.
It is so ELF is executable and linkable format. That is the file format for binary files.
Is it randomize the memory? Yeah.
Right, exactly. This is useful
Initialize the space.
address
Yeah.
space layout randomization. So if you aren't familiar with this, the kernel randomizes the memory addresses of certain sensitive data just to prevent attacks where someone could know where to look exactly to get that.
Does garbage disposal use a random number?
It's user space. There's no garbage disposal languages used inside the kernel.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Just name I was thinking of just clearing this up.
I think it's funny they call it consumers, and then the apps are Subversion and PHP. I'm not sure if it's right consumers.
The other big consumer, well, like consumers and customers maybe, or users eventually.
Also, the year was a while back.
2012.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So the other big customers were these. We're on the desktop, Chrome browser, and SVN, Subversion, version control system, like somebody pointed out. Remember 2012, Git had not yet fully taken over the world.
Yeah.
We still used, I still used Subversion until about 3-4 years ago. That is all HTTPS SSL traffic from both of those, Chrome and SVN. And perhaps I'm showing my ignorance again, but I was a little bit surprised by that. I always figured that for HTTPS stuff, everything's all fixed and taken care of once you generate your certs, your SSL certs. You've got your private key, you got your public key. What else do you need? You shouldn't need anything? Not so. These connections continue, HTTPS and SSL, continually generate new keys as they operate, and that's exactly what we see with that. The entropy consumers on the file server were different in maybe a predictable way. More PHP than before. And here we have Apache in action. And again, these reflect SSL business. PHP, of course, being a very web app heavy language. And then within the kernel here on the file server, we have this function inet frag secret rebuild. That is for randomizing the hash table used to store IP datagram fragments. That's another security measure. It was a new one on me, and it didn't seem interesting enough to dig into, so I'm just telling you what I read. No questions about that one, please. And on the computing server, which has minimal user space to speak of, we see only these two kernel functions that we saw before as the users of entropy. So I'll show you this one last graph. This goes back to what you mentioned here. So this is the size of the entropy pool over a large number of clock cycles for the desktop system on top, the file server in the middle, and the computing server on the bottom. So the desktop system shows the largest variability, with the entropy usage building quickly and then being used in sudden bursts, and then you rebuild it. There's not really any shortage except, well, maybe this one part here in the middle, you get down pretty low, but it's pretty quickly rebuilt too. So it doesn't seem like chronic shortage is an issue there. The file server system, you see, it seems slower to build Entropy because it doesn't have those peripherals to generate Entropy. Its Entropy comes from disk lookups, which it has to do regularly because it's getting all those files to serve. Do note that the axis on that one covers only 1/10 the number of cycles as the desktop above it. That's because the server mostly sleeps in between network requests, so it has fewer cycles. If you plotted those top two graphs on the same scale, you would see that Entropy buildup slope in the second one be a lot closer to the examples you see on the desktop. It wouldn't be quite as steep, but it's still, the scale here makes this look more dramatic than it is. You also don't see like huge drop-offs except at once at the very end of Entropy usage. It seems to come more in rarer events. Now the computing server at the bottom is a different story. So the action there is all in CPU and memory compared to the other two systems. So it doesn't have nearly the Entropy buildup rate from peripherals or as many hard drive lookups. Even if network interrupts were a bigger factor, we'd still expect it to have fewer of them than the other two systems. And you can see the Entropy pool remains close to zero the entire time. And the authors of this paper note their quote is, the situation is almost a constant Entropy shortage for the computing server. Now, I have to wonder if this situation improved much with the new additions to the LRNS with Lake 2 and Cha-Cha 20, because those do provide a more efficient throughput of Entropy, but I wonder how much the effect is. I would be interested in seeing a more recent recreation of this, and especially given how much work is done on dedicated computing servers and how much of that work relies on having randomization, like things that do Monte Carlo simulations or Markov chain fitting. And I assume AI stuff has to use a lot of random seeds for its things. So if you do any heavy computation on a Linux computing server, it might be worth your while to look into this situation, see if that's gotten better, and see if you're really getting all the Entropy you need, especially if you need to stay secure with it.
Do you know what at all was going on the compute server?
Mostly just that it doesn't have many sources to build from. So when it does use it, it builds up a little, uses it for things like address space randomization, and then drops back off and doesn't build it up as quickly.
Clearly, it's loading a lot of binaries if it's losing all of its entropy.
Which makes sense. Right?
So I was saying if it's like just running virtualized environments, right? Then
It could be. I don't.
maybe the container has got its own operating system gathering entropy and stuff.
Well, it did say Apache, so maybe it's just a web server.
Well, the file server was their web server. They did have Apache on that. The computing server, I don't think they gave many details on. They might have. I didn't read super close to this. It could be in there somewhere.
2012 compute server.
Yeah, probably not containers.
Yeah.
Can you get Entropy from like Wireshark logs?
From what?
Wireshark logs?
You
Like VMware.
you could get the network events that would trigger an IRQ, and from that you could take measure an Entropy. The system doesn't take from Wireshark, though, if that's your question.
I was just wondering if you could write a program that would use that as a source.
Yeah, you could use that and check. You could check it against the sources that you get from IRQ here from the kernel and see if they match up. See if you can see. One thing that occurred to me, probably occurs to most of you, that I didn't look deeper into is when you use IRQs for Entropy, it seems like that opens a pretty clear possible attack surface where someone could bombard your network card with requests and just the right timing to make it generate Entropy that they can then guess.
Or if you run out of Entropy, would that make you predictable?
It mathematically it makes you more predictable, but the more
more
is still
predictable,
a pretty
really
high
not.
threshold. You're going from like it would take you the age of the universe to compute to.
You
it
have
would
to have
take you
really
billions
good
of years.
access to take advantage of the loss of entropy like that.
So as far as we can tell from the map, right, there are no known attacks that would circumvent that.
Is there something in the dev file system that we can use to view what our current kind of entropy pool size is?
There are, there are.
Paul Rand
Let
is
me
gonna get blocked.
see. I'm going to
Yeah.
jump out of the thing here and look. Let's see, where could I get to?
HDMI cable going to
I'm never going to find it.
that would be.
Yeah, so the authors of this paper do show the functions you can use to make the inquiries they made.
Because you know how people have little graphs that like show their CPU or whatever. It'd be kind of cool to have like just a graph running in your desktop that's showing your randomness
Yes.
throughout
No.
the day.
Yeah,
There absolutely is a function to do that, and I didn't write it down.
it fills up though.
Yeah,
If
so
it's
there,
not needed, so you
there
don't
is a limit.
stock up randomness.
right, yeah, there is a limit, and the current one, if
The
you,
kernel fills, and then
Mhm.
it pours out. It's all it holds. so to
you
speak.
can check the size of your random and urandom files. They're limited to 256. And it's one of the papers I was reading makes the point that I may have written that down.
256 bits.
Bits, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
256
as far as
bits.
we are concerned, that fills up really fast. As far as people in our
Reasonably, yeah.
space.
Usually, unless you're
Yeah.
doing something that keeps drawing from it. But somebody made the point with the Blake 2S hash and the Cha-Cha 256 bits will keep you going for a long time, based on all of our understanding of the math behind it.
That INET function that you had mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
I'm 90% certain that that is the one that when you do a TCP handshake, for example, you use a random starting sequence number for all TCP traffic in order to prevent a man-in-the-middle attack from guessing like the next one in the sequence.
Okay, that makes
Well,
sense.
also, the public-private key is just used on the initial connection setup. After that, they exchange a symmetric key
Right.
using that.
Because that's faster.
symmetric
Make
is so
one-
much faster.
Make
Okay.
one on the fly
Yeah,
for the Diffie-Hellman exchange, and then you send that.
so that's probably the keys that are being generated out of those symmetric
Right.
keys.
Okay, great.
They expire quickly. Like in order to just be like, if you can guess what it is, it expires. It varies, but it's like within a minute to an hour.
Yeah, but most of the clients generating them send.
No, actually, both created from a known public secret. Neither knows what the actual correct key is that the other one is using.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Well, I had originally planned to do a little bit of delving into the utilities that Linux provides for investigating and characterizing the entropy of a file or a set of bits. I did not have time to do that, so I am going to draw the me talking part of this presentation to a close. Open it up to the floor for questions or more discussions like we've been having. These are great. Anybody have anything to?
My question about your initial physics entropy analogy.
Mhm.
Just my vague understanding, people talk about like the heat death of the universe, right? Is that things always need to trend towards increased entropy.
Right.
So if it's a ratio between everything and what we know, like, does that just only mean that what we know has to shrink because everything is not getting bigger?
Correct. Well, so what you're referring to is the second law of thermodynamics. This is one of the more famous laws. It says entropy in a system, entropy in a closed system always has to increase. So first of all, I do want to make the distinction that applies to thermodynamic entropy only. Things for which you can measure volume, pressure, temperature, those things. But that is the thermodynamic question that you asked. So yeah, and that's basically what that says is that we have a fixed system. That outer, look at that to it. Yeah, yes, the outer circle is fixed for a closed system. And what the second law of thermodynamics says is that what we can know by measuring pressure, temperature, and all that has to keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And so that then at the supposed or the predicted heat death of the universe is where everything is just noise. There's nothing predictable about Just the universe is awash in random radiation with no patterns, no guessability. Yeah. But that's,
Got some fun.
yeah, we got a few weeks. Don't worry, don't worry.
Fun way to remember the three laws of thermodynamics are you can't win, you can't break even, and you can't leave the game.
Yeah, well, that's great.
Nothing.
Huh.
Wait, so I have a question.
Hmm?
So like if like thermodynamic entropy always has to increase,
Hmm?
but in the heat death of the universe, everything is like uniformly spread throughout the whole universe. Does that mean like informational entropy has to decrease?
Yeah,
Okay.
it would also increase. Somebody has a input.
I think their internet's cutting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But so there is a link. Are we getting somebody?
I think Shay's internet is really bad.
There is a link between thermodynamic entropy and information or Shannon entropy. It's I'm not up on it well enough to have tried to introduce it tonight. I would need to read a lot more to show her up on it. But yeah, so yeah, that's there's no in the heat death of the universe. There's no information which will signal somebody a meaning for anything. But they're linked. That's a good point.
Okay. I have another question.
Yeah.
So theoretically, you get anything that takes shot noise to generate a ton of randomness and just pipe it to the kernel, right?
That's one of the more popular hardware random number generators.
Okay.
Is something that produces shot noise. If there's thermal noise in a circuit,
Okay.
then you can. There are functions in the kernel that let you import from a random piece of hardware. So you would just write a driver for that and do that.
Would you know off the top of your head how expensive these are? I've never seen one.
First build one.
Yeah,
but
I was.
I've never seen
I'm
one.
halfway partway through.
The avalanche breakdown of reverse biasing a diode is
Yep.
extremely random.
You
My
got very
favorite
broad.
one is Cloudflare uses a wall of lava lamps
Yeah.
and they point a camera at it. And so
Yeah.
just they get entropy out of the video footage of moving blobs of goo.
Yeah, that's very cool.
So like, are the only people who buy like these like NSA and
I'm sure they're big customers. I would think anyone who runs, well, I think certainly based on that last graph I showed, anyone who runs a high performance computing center that does any kind of proprietary research or modeling of well, I think any research university, like Clemson, for example, is going to be doing some kind of research on powerful computers that's potentially sensitive and maybe even classified. Like, the aerodynamics engineering team might be designing a new plane wing for a fighter. Any place like that, I would think, would want to make sure that they have all the entropy they can get for doing things like those Monte Carlo simulations of airflow over a wing or something like that. I don't know, but I would guess that it's the NSA state level people and people doing really protected work.
Seems like you could hook it up to a video driver and get measure the HDMI cable maybe. I wonder if that would be predictable.
A
That
lot
might
of it
be
just comes down to
predictable.
like how random do you actually need to be? Like back in the 90s, the way it was done in hardware was you just take a bunch of NOT gates and attach them together with a feedback loop, and the thermals inside the chip.
That would
be enough
keep up,
in order
and that
to-
would keep up, for instance, and not like run out.
It doesn't. It's not good enough.
Okay.
It's not actually truly random. You can actually model that now.
Oh, you
and
can?
so
Okay,
it's,
that's
it's
what I'm
not
wondering.
quite good enough.
I thought
That's
maybe a
where-
cable would be modified.
That's where like avalanche reverse current or the timing on an avalanche breakdown of a diode is like one of the few things we found that's like available in a hardware package and truly random as far as we know.
And it'll keep up.
Well, I mean,
Pretty
yeah,
much.
you gotta
Depends.
plug an extra thing in and
Yeah.
like use it constantly now.
like is that easier than shot noise?
Well, that's the but how random do you want? Because like you could also just like turn on your own webcam and face it towards a cat or something, and like you got random. Like
It's
what are
not.
you looking for? It's not really random, but like it's random enough for anything you or I are doing.
It's unguessable.
Yeah.
You'll never guess exactly what the
Just get a USB stick of random numbers.
$80?
No. I'm gonna put on the Linux.
You could have a microphone on the
It's
list
just a
for
list of
recording
random
birds and
numbers.
animals.
Oh, it's just a USB stick
I would-
that
Yeah, I would
provides,
wonder.
Don't provide the
Yeah.
service. No,
Yeah.
okay, I thought somebody said, here's a list, it's got a gigabyte of random
For
numbers.
example,
Yeah, it's a device.
Yes, yes, just, that's what we're talking about.
We gotta plug the data.
At the time, the birds and do it.
And there's so many things we can do. I ran years ago. My first introduction to assembly is guy, assembly guy,
Figure out which set is doing what.
back in the eighties, be able to get gigahertz and get those. And I never learned how, 'cause I never could get to that.
I
You did figure something out. Was that, and then I'm looking at it now, you couldn't go to a sentence. That's what got me, it's like, you can do high level crap on that whole thing goes 386.
All right, so this is an excellent demonstration of randomness. I appreciate everyone. Ben had a question. How random is radio noise?
Oh, radio as in radio waves or radio as in radioactivity?
Noise.
No, just radio static.
Radio static?
Not as much as you'd like.
Right, there is so
Really?
about,
Because it's a frequency too.
right, about, I think, I want to say 10% of radio static is from the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is,
Oh,
as far
okay.
as we know, perfectly random. But that's only 10%. The rest of the stuff you get is yeah, like you said,
It's a
is
mixed
less,
station. Be
right.
predictable.
And it's things you can kind of guess from attenuation of what the signal goes through and how it bounces off the atmosphere. I know there's at least there's some Tom Clancy book where there's like the people at the NSA or something stick an antenna up in the air, and they do try to do something like that. They do radio noise, making a cipher, or maybe I'm thinking of Neil Stephenson, one of those books. Anyway, so that is something you can do, but it turns out you don't get a lot of randomness relative to how hard it is to do.
I have another question. Like the classic random is like TV static.
Uh-huh.
Isn't that shot noise? Isn't that random?
Cosmic background.
Some of it is, I guess. I don't really know.
That's right.
It's the same thing, though, right? I mean,
Yeah, 'cause it's all
it's the same
The
thing.
thing is like, as long as you can model the system that it's going through, so it's random noise coming from frequency, and then as long as you can model a CRT, for example, now it's no longer, like that piece is no longer contributing to randomness.
Okay.
Robert says consider the effect if the background microwave is radiation was. Let me start over. Consider the effect if the background microwave radiation was found to not be random.
Yeah.
I think the effect would be mostly on our models of cosmology. That would be a big one.
Yeah, it would be
We don't-
other effects that randomness.
I can't say beyond that. That's far away from any expertise I have, so I don't know. Just
Hey, look, it says something.
speculate randomly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fun thing to think about. That
Isn't that what Boink?
Coincides.
multiple universes.
Yeah.
Boink. Yeah, that's
What was
what, wasn't Boink trying to like scan the background microwave radiation?
There's been a few.
Or was that just for yeah, to find the radar?
I'm trying to think.
Stuff
What's
like
the
pulsars,
last
right?
big one? But
I know
yeah,
there's, like,
you're right. I know what you're
proteins.
talking about.
There's ones that fold proteins, but
Okay, then Ben says that would coincide with multiple universes, and Bob says reality would be semi-deterministic.
It would mean that we started with a much higher entropy state, I guess, than we currently think we do. Yeah, I don't know. That's good. Any other questions then? I hadn't noticed this is all here.
Oh, I hide it every once in a while.
All right, well, I hope everyone found that a little bit interesting, maybe a little enlightening. I know I learned stuff, so that's
Yeah.
that is good.
And you were creating a device before.
I was thinking about it. I haven't made too much progress other than getting the Arduino dealt with. But yeah, so I've got a couple of these small cosmic ray muon detectors, and I was
That's
thinking if I could put those together in a way that if that would generate randomness from the interactions or measurements of cosmic rays as an experiment. Yeah, that's ongoing. I'd still like to do that, but it's other stuff keeps coming up.
Of course.
Well, it's good, but is there is the amount of randomness used, consumed, it's like an infinite amount must be going on a really geometric curve compared to
Used by what?
by everybody.
Oh.
Randomness wasn't seen as something that you could consume 20 years ago, basically.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was something that kind of didn't exist in the way that it's been using now.
In computing?
Just in general. I mean, just it was 30 years ago. It wasn't such a, it was a concept most at the furthest reaches.
And it wasn't really discussed.
Concepts, you know what I
as a
mean?
technical issue.
And now it's something that's more common than we can believe, and it's used more commonly than gasoline.
Right,
And it's accelerating. And so I'm wondering what part randomness might play in computer systems in 10 years.
No, that is a good question.
You know, as other systems come on that threaten what's available, you know, and I'm thinking how it compares to say 20 years ago when you would ask people about the security of their randomness and all this, you know, and
The necessity for more randomness is what
but they would look at you like, or whatever. I
Yeah.
flip everything, you know, like you're crazy, you know, and now it's like coming to not the forefront, but it's coming to where it's something that matters. And I'm wondering where it'll be in 10 years, you know, when maybe it's been broken or
Could be, yeah. I
needs
mean,
to be supplemented or
I think the big change to look for there is probably going to be cryptography and quantum computing. So that'll change everything about algorithms for guessing things will change completely. We'll have better ones for.
But then you were talking about the random numbers. Were you talking about putting them in a header and separating the data with them? You were talking about using a random
For
number to
packets?
put it like a data stream or something.
Oh yeah, no, the INET protocol or the INET datagram protocol
Okay.
that they're using.
Okay.
Yeah, so you use a lot of it, but
But I'm just wondering
The
if
thing
you will
is,
start
like,
using more
when-
and more and more and
when
more.
as a user do you really need actual like true randomness? And generating like your own private key is about one of the few times you really truly need actual full-on randomness. Even like the INET datagram randomness, like it's that transmission, even if it's a WebSocket, is over within like an hour, and it'll just refresh a new one, and like the attack vector for that is very small.
I know where I was going. I wonder if things will have changed in 10 or 15 years.
I
Just
think maybe
on.
cryptocurrencies, for example, would definitely need like large portions of randomness because you got so much time to go ahead and generate it and encrypt it.
One thing, if your random is limited to 256 bits, like I don't know, that feels like a small number. So it kind of seems like we have way more randomness than we need in general.
It's a buffer of 256 on top of like how fast it's being generated, like as you go.
Right,
So
but
it
like
keeps replenishing itself.
Yeah.
you could, if we like need it more, I could conceivably.
You don't
make
need
a-
as much as you
store up a
Like you're not
terabyte
writing the whole
of
private
entropy and
like
have it
universe.
read.
You're just like seeding a hash.
It's
Right,
just
yeah,
a
most of the time when you consume it.
Also, apparently, there's been an instruction. I don't know which architecture specifically. They tell like Intel, but then AMD added it to like access a hardware random number generator.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
apparently they're in CPUs now, like
Okay.
since Broadwell
I
Zen.
thought I had heard about that, but I hadn't.
I don't
It's
trust
already at that.
So they might. I don't. Yeah, I'm like curious.
I immediately just trust
It's like,
it.
how is it working?
Yeah.
Is it a cycle? You know, like who knows?
The old phone chips used to have that. I think it was Broadcom's phone chips that Motorola was using. They had like a hardware random generator in it. That was the not gate cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, my guess is it's probably not as high quality as like a dedicated random number generator.
It would be a big incentive to make sure it was guessable by at least one person.
Yeah, everyone talks about like, oh, you need a TPM now. Like
That's
you know,
true. I bet it's not open source,
Mhm.
written on their CPU.
Fantastic. Any other Questions? Good discussion. Okay.
I think Ben is proposing a random number generator of what if you divide by zero on an analog calculator?
Oh, stand back. Somebody try it, but I want to be a hero. Yeah. Good question.
Oh, there's a video of it. There's a video.
I don't know what
Of
this is.
dividing by
Dividing by zero on a mechanical
Yeah.
calculator. not
Mechanical
analog
calculator.
one.
Yeah. Was it LEDs? Was it little lights?
No, it was a physical
Like
rotating.
Rotating, okay.
Yeah,
I
and
had
then
one that had lights on it.
Yeah, if you divide by zero, it just spins it. It just spins, it never stops.
Yes.
Mhm.
Those are made. Ever seen inside of one of those things? It's insane. I was at a workplace somewhere in the accounting office, and there was the mechanic there, and he had the cover off of this thing, and it makes the most insane transmission look like nothing.